I received an email this week in my inbox from someone that I follow on a regular basis, and they were sharing a story about hiring an intern to be on their team. And she shares in this email that he was smart, eager, and ready to learn. But what they didn't realize was he didn't just pick up their culture, they actually had to teach it to him because culture isn't something that people absorb by osmosis. Culture is taught, not caught. She goes on to say in this email, it's a language and every organization has its own dialect. Disney has cast members. Chick fil A says, my pleasure. The words we use aren't just semantics, they shape our culture and set a tone for how we engage with our team, with our customers, and I would go as far as to say, even with our families. So, today on this episode, Eric and I want to dive into talking about culture and how we create culture in all of these different places. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Teresa McCloy, and I am grateful to be with you today.
And I'm your co host, Erica Vinson. And as Teresa said, we're thrilled that you're listening in today as we dive into discussions about life, business, and all the things that really matter.
Here on the podcast, we embrace a holistic approach to living, a way of life that's rooted in rest, not rush. It's about connecting to our real self, our real life, and our real work, and remembering who God uniquely created us to be, and redefining success through a different lens.
So, whether you're here to find inspiration, practical advice, or just a moment of connection in your day, we're glad you're here. Let's dive into today's conversation.
As I shared at the top of the podcast, we want to talk today about culture. And I think it really fits in with when we say we talk about life and business and all the thing that matters, all the things that truly matter, because culture is something we create really everywhere we go. And as I read this email this week, it really did get me thinking about language. We've been talking with some of our coaches this week about the language that they use. And it just got me thinking about how much our words help shape culture.
We have actually talked about the power of words before. You can go back and listen to episode 302, and it was really about how language shapes our lives. It's a great place to begin or a complement to this episode. But yeah, let's dive in today as we're talking a little bit about how do we identify what culture already exists and create culture as well.
So I think there's three areas I'd like for us to look at. And let's talk first about the culture we create in our home and our home environment. Then I'd like to talk a little bit more about the culture that we create at work and then move into some practical thoughts around how we've done that even through our work environment, not only with our team, but also with the language and some of the things we've developed that are really core parts of the content that we use. So let's talk first about the home environment. So the language that we use really shapes expectations and behaviors as we interact with those that are significant in our lives, that are living in the same proximity to us or around us. I now have adult children in my life, so they're not with me all the time, but I still feel like I'm creating a culture. What are some of the ways, Erica, that you think when you think about culture in the home space?
I know as you're talking about the parent role as a child, even growing up in the home space, there are things that were just a part of our normal everyday life. And when we sat down for a meal, if we gathered, we prayed before we ate dinner. And so that was part of our culture. And I didn't think twice about it as a child because it was just part of what we did. So that was one thing for me. What about for you?
I do think there were some rhythms, routines, cultures that were created that we often had our lives as I was growing up. I grew up on a farm. My mother was a teacher, my dad was a farmer. And so our lives revolved a lot around school. And I look back now and think how much the school environment shaped our culture because my mom taught at the same school that we were in. There was just a lot around sports activities and school activities. There were two things that shaped us, school and church. Those were the
Mm.
two things that we did. And that's how I grew up. But I also remember, and this is a strange thing that pops into my head, things like Saturdays were the day that we cleaned the house, and it was my responsibility to do certain things in those chores. And it probably was because throughout the week we were so busy with school things and after school things. My brother was very involved in sports. I think there was a message of responsibility. I remember not always wanting to, and I'm not saying my parents did it right, they did it wrong or whatever, but it was, you need to do this and this. But there wasn't always a message given to me of why we did what we did. I'm not shaming my parents at all, but I don't know that always in the culture that we created it, there was a why. Why do we save money? Why do we clean our home? You get it after a while as a kid, but there was a lack of that connection that maybe driving home that message of the why we do these things could be important in the cultures that we create in the home.
And I know I grew up, my dad was a Christian financial concepts counselor. And I learned very early, like, it's important to save receipts, learning to balance a checkbook and pick up after yourself and all of those things that, they're just part of that, as you mentioned, the responsibility piece. But I even think about presence. We're in a very different age where screen time and those types of things have started to be very prevalent in families and kids' lives. And we didn't have some of that same distraction until later into the teenage years for me, when it was, we didn't bring our phone to the table because that was a time to be present, and it was a time to be where your feet are and to have conversation and really embrace that space as a family, or if we had friends over, that we were present.
And the things that we say to one another matter. You could say, "Stop interrupting me."
Mm.
And yet it's like we respect each other's time is the opposite of that. So it's not wrong to say things like, "Stop interrupting me," or whatever to our kids, but it's the why behind that. And I was one of those kids that often asked, "Why? Why does that matter? Why does it matter if I break that rule? Why does it?" And it's not that your home has to have rules, although you may call them that. It's the culture. On the flip side of that, I also grew up in the culture that I was in within the home when I was growing up, that I never had a curfew. And yet almost everyone else that I knew had a curfew. And I was just brought up to know the culture of our home, that there was a time to be home. I remember mom flipping the lights on me one time as I was sitting out in the driveway. But I knew, and I don't know how I knew, again, never communicated. I wished it would have been when I look back, because there was this angst in me sometimes that was a guess. And so I remember raising my own kids and giving them a time to be home, because that created a culture and we're all safe. We're all here trying to create a culture of coming around the table, like you said, being together. When is technology allowed in the home? When is it not? How do you manage it? All of the things that are so different. When you said bring the phone to your table in high school, I'm like, no, I didn't have a phone until I was an adult and long after I was an adult. All of those things have become more and more things that we have to create that environment around. And I believe we do that through words
Mm.
and through
Yeah.
using words. Yeah, I just think that the value of our words do matter. And there's so much of what we create. Some people may write things down. They may have a family rules list or guidelines that we follow. And we'll talk about that more in a minute when we talk even in the workspace. But whatever works for you, just say, what are the things that we live by? What
Yeah.
happens in our home that's intentional and creates an alignment? What do you think some of the benefits are, Erica, when we come to that place of creating culture?
As you were talking about even communication being so key, I was thinking about just how it honors what we value. And some of our listeners, like myself, maybe they live solo. They may not have a large family, or as you mentioned, your kids are grown and it's you and your husband in that space. And so you do create the culture that you value. One of the things I value in my culture is simplicity. I live in a very small space, but I have what I need. And it's important to me to have harmony in this space and order. I appreciate being able to live that out. And so I do think it's important, because when we start to get into needs and values, what do we need? in the space as well. And so when we really can uncover what some of those things are, it can help to guide some of the culture that we create and really answer some of that why that you were talking about. It's important because if I have a motivation or a reason, I'm much more likely to stay on track and to honor what I need and value.
No, that's great to bring in. And we work with that tool. It's an assessment that we have that's unique to the work that we do, the needs and values assessment. And we can link to some of that in the show notes. And you can find that if you're interested in diving more into that, because it may help you create the culture that you're in. And I love how you brought up even living alone. You have your childhood to reflect on. And different things, but you chose several years ago to say, I'm moving out of this larger space into something smaller as I'm living solo, as you said. And that has created a different culture and also opened up things. I just recently, during my sabbatical time, cleaned out so much of our home because we've lived in the same home, my husband and I, for over 40 some years. And we just have a lot of, I would say, past culture of having kids in our home and all that. We're moving into new culture of grandkids and things like that. But we also wanted to simplify and we don't need all the things that we need. So, along with words, I think what we're uncovering and discovering is there's a what do you surround yourself with? What are things that matter to you? The items that matter, the keepsakes that matter, the things that create those things. Because if you picture in your mind right now as you're listening, walking into someone's home, walking into their culture, their small little piece of their world, you get a feeling pretty quickly for who they are. I've been to your space that you think is small. I don't think it's that small, but it's much smaller than where you were. And you have uniquely chosen certain things. You and I have both experienced that in the past few months, going through things and still going through and cleaning out and saying, what matters to me in the culture that I'm creating in this season of my life? That's a whole process that might tie to your needs and values and personality and all of that. So, all of it comes into play as you create this home environment. And I'm a little not sure if we want to separate these two, but we do separate them. We are so much in the work that we do and how we want to show up in the world of like your personal and your professional life. But for this conversation, I think it's important to think because they carry over and they are two cultures and two ways you're approaching. But let's talk a little bit about the work environment and the culture that we might want to create there before we move into kind of how we've done that.
When we piece together and move, as you said, home and work, we're talking about them separately here for the sake of just highlighting them. And also, they all belong. So when we bring that values into the conversation, when you think about what you value as a work team, or if you're a solopreneur, the things that you value and how you want to show up at work, that is really a great place to begin because we can't be one way in our workspace and expect to show up at home in a completely different way.
And when you think about it, you and I both work from home, and many people do in our environment nowadays, and they do overlap greatly. That you may have, if you're in a room all by itself, which I know you are, I am, like, how does that space, how does that culture be different? So there's a physical culture at work, just like there is in your home. I actually have chosen to make my culture in a co working space and chosen not to work from home all the time and to be able to come because I want a culture of community within and be surrounded by some of that energy and that environment. And I work some in my local businesses. And so I want that culture to be that I'm available and that I'm there. And I think this is a struggle right now because of the virtual world we live in, that there is no work culture. We're creating it in an online space and it's different for everyone. Things like showing up on Zoom meetings and am I on camera? Am I off camera? What does it look like behind me? Am I in my bedroom and that's okay? Or do I need to be in a professional space? There's all kinds of things on social media. I have the business attire on the top and the pajama bottoms on the bottom. Like, how does that make you feel when you show up? And halfway getting dressed because
Yeah, the word
that's good enough.
mm, the word that came up as you were talking was confusion. And I
Yeah.
thought it really is about the self-confusion of I'm professional, or now I'm going to go do a load of laundry and then I'm back. When am I available? I was just having this conversation with a friend who works in the corporate space, and we were just talking about even the COVID season really changed things where it was like, okay, there's so many possibilities and we can be virtual and so we can work from anywhere. And we also don't allow ourselves the permission to say, this is the end of my workday always, or
Yeah.
these are my boundaries, just as you would in a brick and mortar. We don't drive by Chick-fil-A on Sunday and pull up and think they take a Sabbath. And so it's such a great model and one that's actually very successful in the business world. Jesus taught us to rest too, but
Right.
we don't all do it. We don't
Well,
give ourselves the
because we
permission.
feel that we're on all the time. And that's the clarity and alignment that you need to create for yourself. For many of you, whether you're working as a solopreneur, an entrepreneur, or you're working on a team that everybody gets to be virtual, or you show up in the workspace part of the time. And part of their problem is they come in 3 days a week and 2 days a week they work from home and nobody knows when the others are going to be in. So it's a confusion. So
Yeah.
culture is created. I've talked before, I've done a whole series on the 7 P's of business and how you create your purpose, your mission, your vision, your planning. How often are you going to have meetings? When are people supposed to be there? What are the hours that they're available? And I think one of the things that culture creates is safety for people to not have confusion, to not have mental exhaustion of, do I need to take this call? Do I have to take this call? This is my personal phone, but then it's my work phone. Or my son in law carries two phones because one is his work phone and one's his personal. And maybe that helps. I don't know. That's all for your work team and your environment to decide. But whatever you set up is definitely going to create that culture. I want to refer back to a minute. I want to refer back for a minute to this email that actually spurred this whole thought and conversation for me. She's talking in here about the clarity, and again, going back a little bit to language of maybe your organization actually needs to create kind of a culture dictionary of or glossary of terms, or these are the ways we say that. Some of the examples she gives is calling something an organization rather than a company
Mm,
or a team rather than employees. Neither one is wrong. They're just different and they create a different culture. You mentioned Chick-fil-A, them always saying that my pleasure phrase. That is a part of their culture. But she says in here that clarity builds confidence.
mm,
So if you're struggling, whether you have one person on your team or 50, with people having confidence, that may be why. They may be very competent to do the job, but you wonder why your culture isn't better.
mm.
It
Yeah.
may be that they don't know the language. And I have learned as a leader of our team that you guys will call me out if I say it one way one time and one time the next, because we know that we want to be consistent in the culture. If I'm always going to express it one way, then that's probably what's truest in my heart. And we all need to buy into the example I gave the other day was our place that we gather all of our people together. I used to call it a retreat, and it was a weekend that we came together. And then I'm like, no, let's call it a gathering. And I thought that sounded better, but I could never say it. It just never came out of my mouth. So we needed to stay with the word retreat and call it what was consistent so that everybody would hear the same thing. So those are some of the ways I think about culture is they really are the undercurrent of what people buy into and
Mm.
what they get on board with. It's so important. I hear people talk about it all the time.
Yeah. Speaking of time, I think that's part of culture. I've heard it multiple times this week from people on our team to people not in the work they do with our team, but we do contract with others. And there are these spaces where sometimes it's so meeting heavy that then you end up with tasks or action steps from each meeting. There's not a project block, as we would call it, an actual, like, really focused work time where they can spend 60 minutes, 90 minutes actually unpacking what just happened in that meeting. So then the culture is we have to create this culture of busyness that, oh, I got to do this and grind it out at home.
Mm.
And so, where do those project blocks belong in a culture if you're leading a team that you could offer people space? We offer kids in high school a study hall
Yeah.
from time to time, sometimes not in the most advanced placement courses, right? Where it gets so tedious and a lot of work. So, as the work level goes up, where is the space that we're offering to actually get the work done?
Oh, I hear that all the time with people of, we're going to have this meeting and we're going to set our yearly goals. Yearly goals could be great. They could work in your culture. But if your culture is to create those goals, but you never give people time to break those goals down and put them into what we call projects and then have some action steps around them, they just feel like you piled on a whole bunch of things. And when they come to their review, they're going to say, I didn't have time to get it done. And then it's this culture of endless cycle of being on the hamster wheel of we're always behind. I think all those things are important and they're all part of language and words and some written down things, having that purpose, mission, vision, values type of work done. And so let's talk a little bit, Erica, from this workspace and kind of stay in that frame of some things that we do around that create culture. I think one of them that I've enjoyed the best, and it probably came 2 or 3 years ago, as we were struggling with all being contractors on the team, and I might work different times than you worked, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody's working different amount of hours and have different contractual obligations, but it caused some confusion in when am I supposed to be available? When am I not? And so we came up with some team guidelines, is what we call them. And they really come from that place of how we want to live on our team and really out into the bigger world. How do we want to show the world how this can be done? And that's that idea of living from a place of rest, not rush. What's the one of our team guidelines? We'll go through them. What are the ones that matter to you the most when you think of them?
I think we do honor response time. So, as you're saying, we don't have an expectation that everyone's schedule looks the same, but we do honor that if we're emailing and it's to a client, we know we're going to get back to them in 24 hours. Or if it's something with one of us, we're going to respond, even if it's something, I think we're proactive also about vacation time. And so our communication is really important. It goes on to a big team calendar. I love it's in you're probably looking at it in your office right now. But I even know what color it is on the calendar. But we have our calendar in Google. So everyone can see it. So we've got it electronically. You have it, in your office. And that way we know if someone is out of the office, that things are covered and there's communication about that. So balls aren't dropping just because someone isn't available. I think those are two of the things just with that respect of time and also just how we respond to one another.
And within this culture that we've created, the word that we start it with is honor. And I
Mm,
think it's honoring one another. And that word alone creates a culture. So it's honoring a day off. And for us, it's a Sabbath day. We don't communicate with one another. We could as friends, but we don't communicate about work things on Sundays. We try to honor that. We honor the projects that we've committed to. We start every 90 days with projects that we each have and that we own. And I will be honest to say, in the past, as the owner, the founder of the business, I had a higher expectation of the number of projects we could do and what we could get done. Even since my sabbatical, backed off and said, here's one thing. If you can move this one ball down the court, there's several of us on the team, 4 of us. If you can do this one thing in your area and you can move it down the court, we are going to celebrate that and put that out. And then we break that down into actionable steps. And that culture creates this idea that all of us can see the progress that's happening on that. And we can all come together and celebrate in our team meetings once a month. Oh, that's moving forward. That's great. Or you can say, or whoever's on the project, I'm stuck here. This is where I'm at. And we can help work through that. So I think honoring the projects, you talked about response time. And we really have a thing of really Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are our heavy days during the week where we're available to one another. And we honor those 3 days. But then Mondays and Fridays are a kind of if have to, but we might be working, but we're not like in communication and those types of things. So I think all of those. And the last one, and I think this is huge for lots of organizations that I've worked with as companies, is what are your lines of communication?
Mm.
In today's world, as we said earlier, there's so many ways that we can talk to one another. We can talk to one another on phones and on iPads and on Facebook and on Messenger and on applications. So choosing what are the one, two, or three ways that you communicate and how do you use each one? What's happening in each one? It's beautiful that we can be in communication 24/7, but just because I have a thought and an idea for something and I say it over an application that we use called Voxer, to me, I could be thinking, "Oh, I just told them to do that." And you could be out to dinner with someone and have gotten that message. So some of it's not communicating during off hours, but not putting a to do in a certain place, knowing where does that belong. I think that is one of the biggest things. I'm actually doing a workshop for a team next week. And she goes, communication. Wow, we're still wrestling with what's our culture around that when you have that. So you might consider that for whatever the size of your team is. Even when it was just Erica and I, we had to work through some of these things because we don't live together. We're not in the same home. We're not even in the same cities. How are we going to honor? I don't know what she's doing all the time. And so I don't want to be that interruption because that creates a culture of I'm constantly interrupted. I'm constantly being needed. I'm constantly having to do something. What are your team guidelines? Is there something else that comes up for you that you feel like we do well in that team space?
We've identified clear values. So our values are be present, be real, bring joy, create impact. And so having those clear values, and I think those came out of us all doing our own individual needs and values and then saying, okay, what collectively matters to us?
Mm.
And so for teams and organizations working together, even as you mentioned, if it's just a dual partnership of two people working together saying, okay, here what matters to you, what matters to us in this space. And being able to identify that gives a filter then for what we say yes to, what we say no to, and even how do we represent not only ourselves, but when we're showing up representing the business, the company, then what does that look like? We want to embody those values, and we know that's a collective mission.
And going back to what we talked about first, the culture of your home, I know for many families, this is huge too, because it helps a family know what do we as a family say yes and no to, and how that plays out then be present. So, one of the things we're working on in our team, even in this first quarter, is for some of us on the team just to be able to be on calls. I shared it earlier. My word for the year is be available. That really ties to that value of be present and then show up real. It's not a call to manipulate or to talk, it's to talk, it's to be real and authentic, but also hopefully have some fun while we're doing the work that we do so that it does show up as an impact. So for me, all of our values go together and flow together from the tiniest thing that we might do to serve and help someone else to the impact we might make in the lives of the ones that they are serving because we help other people grow businesses and do things. So those are huge for us underneath. We don't talk about them all the time, but yeah, we all know them. They're simple. We've created them. I actually put them in our monthly team meeting packet every time so that we just have them in front of us and before us. Those are some of the things we've created in culture too, is don't just write these things or do all this work of purpose and mission and vision and values and then stick it in a drawer somewhere. Make it living and breathing and a part of what you're able to go back and reference. And that is the thing of the work that you do, what you're putting out into the world. and how you're consistent with that language and that culture, the culture you put out externally needs to flow from the internal culture that you've created. Even if you're a solopreneur, doing some of this work will affect what you put out. So we have a lot of unique language, a whole glossary of terms that we use around the real life process. You've heard Erica mention some of it today, and it just flows out of us now. Needs and values and action steps and projects and tasks and lots of different things that when you do that deeper work, then whatever you're bringing out into the world will show up externally through the culture that you've created internally. It really goes back to the work that we do in helping people create a rule of life or a life management process for their life. That's a culture internally that they're carrying with them that is going to come out in your home. It's going to come out in your work internally with your team, and it's going to come out externally in the work you do. I think that's enough for today and wrapping up about culture and just take some action on what are my guidelines for my home, for my family, the values that I have. Have some conversations around that with the key adults, maybe in your home or the people that you're with and that you spend a lot of time with. How do we want to show up with each other and create that culture?
Yeah, and when we do create that clear culture and that language, whether it is at home or in our business, we're really setting up a strong foundation for clarity and confidence and alignment. And that's where that rule of life comes in. And I think it's true for us in coaching and other helping professions as well. But having that clear language and the framework for how you serve others really makes all the difference in growing a thriving practice and being clear about that. And so, if you are a coach or a consultant or someone who is in another helping profession who helps others, we would love to invite you to our free webinar that's coming up. It's called Thrive as a Coach: 5 Steps to Growth Without Guesswork. And it's happening on February 25th at 4 p.m. Central. And we're going to be diving in this live training, walking through some steps to grow your coaching business with confidence and some strategies to help you eliminate overwhelm. You can actually register now and save your seat at thereallifeprocess.com/webinar. And we can't wait to see you there.
Eric and I are hosting that webinar together, and we love meeting you and seeing you. If you're there with us live, we'll have some bonus content even for you to take right away from that webinar, that masterclass that we're doing. And another way that you can connect with us in community with us is actually in our free community that we have online. It's off of the social media platforms. The easiest way to find it is to go straight to our website at thereallifeprocess.com and then click on the community tab. And we spell real life with one L. So thereallifeprocess.com. Click on the community tab. You can join in, create a login. You can actually meet other people that are choosing to do life a little bit differently. It's saying it matters to me to have a culture in my own life. It matters to me to have a culture in my home, matters to me to have a culture around the things that matter in my work environment, and just a beautiful group of people that gather there and we can continue the conversation there. I also want to mention one other thing, and I don't do this often, but I went out the other day and was just looking at our podcast online, and we just received the nicest review from somebody of how they love us co-hosting together, Erica. So kudos to the new podcast we started this last fall, Erica being on with me every week. And so if you listen to the podcast, 2 things that you can do that really help us out and encourage us is, one, follow the podcast on one of your social platforms. And then if you would be so kind as to go in, and it's pretty much through the Apple platform, and leave us a review. We love that. It's just so kind. It makes our day. I don't know. Maybe does it make your day, Erica? It made my day when
Absolutely.
I got to read it. It
I
was
wish
very
we could
kind.
all just be sitting in the same room having
I know.
coffee
We would
together.
love that much better if we had
That
coffee in the
would
same
really
room.
make my day.
That would make our day, but we thank you so much. Hey, we just want to remind you too that every day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. And we hope we'll look for them inside of these places, your home, your work. What do you notice today that just stands out for you and say, I want more of that in my life? I want more of that kind of culture. And I want to come and show up in that way that God has uniquely designed me. So we'll be back next week with more from the Doing What Matters podcast.